Welcome to the last in a series of 3 mass care and shelter annex development workshops. The good news about this template is hopefully you saw that a lot of the language has been provided for you. I would say that right now this plan stands about 80 to 85% done. What you'll need to do, and we're going to talk about that in the last part of the agenda today about the post-workshop steps. What you're going to need to do is take this back and really just close it out with those unique areas like organization, some of your procedures, the people, the positions, and names of your emergency operations plan, for example. So you're just going to need to fine-tune it and really develop it out for your unique jurisdictional needs. Or maybe you want to take it back and you want to expand it far beyond where it sits right now. That is your discretion. This is your template to take and run with. But we wanted to really give you something that if you chose, you could pretty much maybe do another month and a half's work. And we're going to cover what that work entails at the very end of this workshop, and you could actually have a plan written in a fairly short amount of time. We are mandated as local jurisdictions to have care and shelter plans. There's actually a number of laws and regulations at the federal, the state, and you may even have local policies that we're mandated to really carry out and make sure that we have these plans, and we'll talk about those. But really, the biggest thing that I always try to think of as an emergency manager, and I can pretty much guess that most of you in the room do what you do for the same reason, is we do this to help people. It's the right thing to do. We have people that depend on us in times of disaster to really provide those services that they need. So why we do it? Yes, it is legally required, and we're going to talk about that. But really, much deeper than that is we have people that depend on us, and our jobs, that's what we signed on for. We're going to talk about that. I want to take just a minute to briefly go over what's in your manual, so you are at least familiar as we go through. We're going to be focusing most of our discussion and attention today on the template, but I do want you to know what the contents of this manual are, because we really work to provide you a lot of resource materials. So the first thing that you should have is this little flip guide on emergency shelter operations. This is a really good best practices flip guide for you. We were able to research and go out there and find that as a resource. So feel free, that's yours to keep, and you can go ahead and reference that and take a look at it. It might actually be a good little resource to develop your own unique checklists and things like that, but we actually do provide you those checklists. The next section of the plan, the first section of the plan, how many people went through the pre-workshop guidance document, had a chance to do that? Very good, because going through that pre-workshop guidance, a lot of the parts, a lot of the areas in the plan, the fill-in, the insert here, was pretty straightforward. So if you went through that pre-guidance workshop material and you followed through and you did a lot of that insert here, a lot of your template work is probably done for you. And then you'll be able to focus on those areas that are a little bit more challenging and difficult, where you have to expand the information. The next section, number 2, is the annex. That's your template, and we're going to go through that throughout the remainder of the day. So the third section is a document that was really developed through Los Angeles County with the assistance of a number of other emergency management organizations across the nation. And this is Strategies for Inclusive Planning and Emergency Response. I heard a couple people mention that they were here for care and shelter training today. This workshop is not a care and shelter training course. It's really a workshop that is focused specifically on developing this template. The good news is, as we go through a lot of the sections, you are going to get information and recommendations on care and shelter sites, operations, organization, and processes, but we don't go into depth and we don't train to a care and shelter capability. Nor do we go into depth on this inclusive planning, which is very complex. So when you leave this workshop, the recommendation is you really sit down and read through this inclusive planning. The good news is a lot of areas in the template have already integrated that inclusive planning language into the template, and I'll point out some of those areas. So you won't have to do an extensive amount of work, but you may have some unique information that you know only in your own jurisdiction. For example, who's responsible for American with Disabilities Act compliance in your jurisdiction. So some of that information you'll have to insert into the template. The next section that we have, section 4, we don't go extensively into animal sheltering either, because we could take a whole day to talk about animal sheltering. We do touch on it throughout today's discussion, but what we wanted to do is give you a really good best practices document that if you're particularly wanting to draft out a separate attachment to this annex template, or let's say you want to draft a separate animal sheltering plan, you can actually take this best practice document and you could actually develop that out. It's pretty straightforward, and it actually a lot of good material in there. And we are going to talk about sheltering of animals and those issues throughout today's discussion, so you will hear something on pet sheltering. The next section is really a resource site for you, and there is a whole extensive list of resource information under this national mass care strategy. I highly recommend that you go on there and just at your leisure, just review through it and note any particular articles or documents or anything like that that might be of value as you move forward. There's a lot of resource material, so I actually gave you the website, but one of the key areas is all of the American Red Cross forms, the care and shelter forms that we included in the back of the manual. Those are all on that site, okay? So you can actually go on that site, scroll down, and I think it says American Red Cross forms, and you can pull up all those forms and go ahead and copy them onto your file and keep them, and then also print out hard copies. So it's a really good strategy, and you'll see those American Red Cross forms. But there's a lot of other good resource information in there. The last couple sections, we move into the actual hard copies of the American Red Cross forms. American Red Cross has a lot of forms, and the good news is, and we'll talk about it in the template as we're moving through, is most of the time they're going to be working with you very closely in partnership at your care and shelter sites. And they know how to do the processes, they are very familiar with the forms, and a lot of time when we're in partnership with them, they're managing this whole process. But there may be times, and we'll touch on those particular situations that may occur, where the city, your city, may be activating a care and shelter site, and Red Cross, think of a regional catastrophic earthquake, 7.8, their resources might be stretched so thin that they have to prioritize, and they may not be able to cover the full region in personnel and staff. So we wanted to provide you these forms. So we've broken them up into two categories. The first section are forms that you would use internally, and we're going to go over these forms at the very end once we get to that section. You would use internally in the shelter. For example, registration forms, shelter facility inspection forms, things like that you're using in the shelter management process. And then the next section are forms that you use with the clients, things like intake form. There's a multilingual shelter communication tool, which actually allows you to do some at least initial basic communication with people coming in to register into the shelter. There's a unaccompanied minors form, for example. So these are really forms that you're going to use specifically directly with the clients. And then the last document that we have, and we're going to go over it in the last part of the section, or the last part of the program, is the post-workshop guidance document. And that's going to be the next steps. Once you leave today, hopefully it'll walk you step by step in the activities that you'll be able to implement in the next month and a half to really close out this plan and move it to a formal review and approval. And we'll talk about that. So everybody have all those in their manuals? Okay, so I'm only going to go through this very briefly because you don't need to know it, but for a lot of you who have never written a plan, it's good to understand the framework. The way we're going to talk a little bit about how many people are familiar with FEMA's Comprehensive Planning Guidance 101, version 2. Okay, so make a note of that. When you get back to your office, I recommend that you pull up that document and save it somewhere. CPG 101 is actually the guidance document to draft plans. So if any of you are going to be moving on to write plans in general, and we're going to go through the steps on how you develop a plan at the very end, that is the guidance document. That is the core resource for all of us if we want to write effective plans that meet compliance, that meet recommended guidelines by FEMA on what is considered a good plan. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the post-workshop. When we talk about levels of plans, in our jurisdictions we actually have different types of plans. And a lot of you are going to be familiar with some of the ones I'm going to throw out. When we talk about strategic plans, that's your master emergency plan. And I want to stop here for a second because you'll notice throughout the document that one of the insert brackets that you will see a lot is a bracket that says insert the title of your master emergency plan. And the reason that it was phrased that way is it is recommended that a jurisdiction's main emergency plan, the strategic level plan that's an overarching presentation of how your jurisdiction is going to manage incidents, that is considered a strategic plan, but they recommend that you call it Emergency Operations Plan, or an EOP. So for the remainder of this workshop, I'm going to refer to it as an EOP. But in your jurisdiction, you might have titled it something different. Sometimes people will have the City of Blank Response and Recovery Plan, or the City of Blank Emergency Response Plan. It's recommended that we call it an EOP, but whatever the title of your plan is, you'll need to insert that throughout the document. So anytime if the EOP doesn't apply to your plan, you'll need to replace that. So that's just a little note on that. One of the things I would recommend, though, as you move forward, is you move to change that title, if it's feasible, to Emergency Operations Plan. Because across the nation, that's kind of the term, and you'll see it a lot in a lot of FEMA courses. That's the term they use. So our EOP is a strategic plan, and all of our functional and hazard specific annexes that support our Emergency Operations Plan are also considered strategic. And what we mean by strategic is we're not going to pick up this annex and we're not going to walk into a shelter and we're not going to be reading that annex verbatim as we're operating in the shelter. It's really just for a presentation of this is how we manage care and shelter operations in our jurisdiction, but it is not a guide or a tactical plan or an operational plan. When we move into operational plan, those are things, how many people are familiar with standard operating procedures? Okay, this is more, and a lot of you who work in departments, this is more a type of plan that's really going to give you those instructional step-by-step procedures, or it may even be a checklist. It's really going to tell you, okay, if we're going to activate a shelter, this is how we notify people. This is how we recall our personnel. This is how we open up the facility. And so it really goes into more of that operational description. Is that fairly clear on that? So strategic is just an overview. Operational moves into more of how we're going to do it. When we talk about tactical, and I know police and fire are probably very familiar, but there may be a lot of departments, your field operations guides can fall into that. That's really where you're getting really specific on those tasks that you are following step by step to carry out an operation. And so when we talk about this annex, it is a strategic plan. It is really going to be an overview of your care and shelter operations. When we talk about any plan, all plans are framed on a risk analysis of our jurisdiction. I heard a number of people have worked on the local hazard mitigation plan. In our local hazard mitigation plan, that's really where we drill down and we do a really extensive job of analyzing the threats in our city. And it isn't just identifying the threats, it's really trying to look at the threat. How likely are we to have this occur? If you're in La Mirada, how likely is it that you're going to experience a tsunami? Highly unlikely. In the city of San Pedro, how likely is it that we may experience a tsunami? somewhat more likely. In fact, they have a whole inundation area that's mapped out. So when we talk about what plans do we need to prioritize, what do we need to focus on, and how do we frame our plans, doing this analysis of what are the risks that we face, okay, what's the likelihood, and then with that hazard or that threat, what's the consequence, what's the consequential impact. So I'm going to take one that most of us, a pandemic. So what's the likelihood of a pandemic occurring for all of us? How many people have had a pandemic that's occurred in their jurisdiction? A very complex pandemic incident. None of us have. So the likelihood of a pandemic is very, very low, right? So our risk is low, but what's the consequential impact of a pandemic event to all of us? It's actually one of the threats that probably has the highest consequence impact outside of a massive earthquake, etc. So even though the likelihood of it happening is low, as far as a plan that a jurisdiction might be focusing on, you would definitely want to include that in your prioritized plans, because even though it doesn't happen very often, when it happens, it's going to be a catastrophic event for all of us. And so we really have to put those plans ahead of time and be prepared for that type of event. So when we talk about plans, we're always looking at that risk analysis. This plan, the annex that we're working on, you don't have to do that risk analysis, and I'm going to tell you how we've actually dealt with that. You don't have to go into depth, but you should have a local hazard mitigation plan, and we reference it. That's really done a good job of looking at all these possible threats and then trying to place them on some kind of a strategic plan of, okay, what's our top threats, and then how are we going to move forward. This is the two plans that should have a full description of the risks that your jurisdiction faces. It should be in the local hazard mitigation plan, and you should have a full description of your risks in your emergency operations plan. So those are the two areas. But luckily for this annex, we're only going to reference it. So right now we're going to start moving into the mass care and shelter annex. And so if everybody can go ahead and turn to this section 2, and this is where we're going to really drop down into why you're here today. Okay, and so we're going to start going through this. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to really be talking a lot to you today because a lot of this is a guidance. Again, this is not a training, but I might open it up for comments, or if anybody has any tips or recommendations. I did hear people in here have some good experience, so please raise your hand. Keep it short because we want to stay on time, but if you have any tips or anything, please share those. And hopefully all of you paid attention to those people in the room that do have extensive experience. And what I would really recommend is, this is the second advantage to a workshop like this, is you get their contact information on the breaks. Okay, and you network with them as you're developing your plan if you have any questions. But I really want to give a shout out to Dave Ashman, Diana Manzanos, and John Panito, because their commitment to making sure that you had this type of workshop, that you weren't just going to walk into your office and have to, from scratch, blindly develop a full-blown plan, especially with a lot of you not having had the advantage of having planning experience. I teach the CSTI planning course, and to develop plans is a complex, it's a complex initiative. But the good news is, if you're the plan writer, you're going to have stakeholders that are going to give you the information. But it is tough putting it into formal plan language. So hopefully their commitment to helping you out, going out and getting grant funds, you're going to have a lot of that language already written for you, so you shouldn't have to do a lot of work. The first thing is on the cover. This is your cover. I gave you a template. You can use it at your discretion. I will tell you, if you decide you want to change this cover, I'm an emergency manager. I'm not a tech expert. So if you do change this, I recommend that you get somebody that's really good at working with technology and Word and all of that, because I was challenged with setting this up. I think it looks fairly nice. I've got some good images, but you can change this. You can change it to pictures that you want. You can change the whole cover to match more the look of other plans that you have. But just be advised, if you start to change it, just grab somebody in your office that actually is really, or if you're techie, then go for it. But just be aware that as you start to change it, you might have some challenges with the pictures and putting them all together. So that would be the only thing that I'm going to say on that. So let me get this up. So if you'll notice, I am multitasking here. I'm going to be working 2 screens. So I'm just going to ask your patience a little bit of, I have to pause for a second to get oriented, but I am going to try to go back and forth between the PowerPoint. This page here, you're going to delete. This was only for your information, so when you move forward after you leave this workshop, go ahead and delete this page. We wanted to let you know that right now this plan, you can't just have somebody sign it and it's ready to go. There's a little bit of work left to do on it. So we didn't want anybody walking out of this workshop, walking to whoever has to authorize your plan, sign it, and moving forward. And I think you caught that because there's a lot of insert here and there's comments that say you'll need to fill this out. But we just wanted you to know that this template is, you're going to need to go ahead and take it out. But we do feel that there's a lot of language that you'll be able to use. Okay. This next page is a plan certification page, and one of the things that is recommended, again, the outline that I provided for you on this template is directly taken and complies with Comprehensive Preparedness Guidance 101, CPG 101. What that means is your template or your plan, when you finally get it finished, meets CPG 101 compliance. So what does that mean? That means that if your program is ever audited for best practices, there is a program that exists in the nation. It's called the Emergency Management Accreditation Program. They actually do come in and they look at your plans and they look how you've formatted them. Your template right now has a basic CPG 101 outline. When you go back to your office and you go in and you review that CPG 101, take a look in there at some additional sections that you can add at your discretion. But right now, this plan with that table of contents is CPG 101 compliant. And so we're going to go through each of those sections. And that was our intent also, is not only to get you to have an effective template, but also one that met some guidance recommendations from FEMA, at the FEMA level. So when we talk about plan certification, your plan, once you finish it, and I don't know what your formal review and approval process is, but once you go through that process, it needs to be adopted by your jurisdiction. And when we look at a formal approved plan, there is somebody in your jurisdiction that has the highest level of responsibility for your jurisdiction. Now that could be, I'm going to use, if you'll bear with me, I'm going to use the City of LA throughout the remainder of the workshop because I can use that to give examples, but it may not apply to your city. So in the City of Los Angeles, for our plans, we had a mayor and we had a general manager for the Emergency Management Department. Our mayor is the director of emergency services per our administrative code and our charter. So our mayor is technically the official person that would say, yes, this plan, I approve it. But in our charter, the general manager of the Emergency Management Department is vested and delegated that accountability and that authority to represent the mayor when it comes to emergency services. Therefore, the general manager of the Emergency Management Department would sign the plan certification. So in your jurisdiction, I don't know how that's set up. This is the first page where, if you notice, you're going to have to do a little bit of redacting to meet the unique needs of your jurisdiction. So one of the first things is you'll need to insert the title of whoever that person is. And then the next thing is, and you're going to see this bracket throughout most of the document, there's a lot of places where you have to insert your jurisdiction. That one you probably could have finished during your pre-workshop guidance. So on this page, you're going to insert the title of the person that's going to be the official signatory that says this is the approved care and shelter annex for the city of La Mirada. I'll use La Mirada for example. But you may have an additional process steps that you have to go through before that final person signs it. In the city of Los Angeles, we have a 15-member council. So what ended up happening is this was our process. We had a draft plan that would go to our emergency management committee. They would review it and they would say, yes, we approve this plan. We're going to move it to our emergency operations board. The emergency operations board was the official operational arm of the city for emergency services, and they would review it and they would approve it. Once it was approved by the board, it would go to city council, and city council would review it and city council would approve it. Once it was approved by city council, then the general manager would sign it. In the case of your city, it might be the mayor or the city manager. So what you'll notice on this page is if you have an additional process that you have to go through, you're gonna identify who that other officiating body is. If you don't have a process, for example, if you're the emergency manager in your jurisdiction and you can walk right into the mayor or the city manager and there's no other process for plan approval, then you're going to delete that information. And this approach goes for the remainder of this document. So there's going to be a lot of places where I'm going to go through how the recommended or how it's written in the template. If it doesn't apply to you, then you're going to delete it. But this is the first place. But this plan certification page, that's where you're going to put that official person. Okay, and the other thing you're going to put in there is the review date, and we're actually going to look at review and maintenance of the plan in a final section of this document. But you're going to want to put in, and if you don't have one, it is recommended that emergency plans get reviewed every 2 to 3 years. So whatever your formal review date is, you're going to go ahead and insert that in the plan. Okay. Any questions on that? It's pretty straightforward. Okay. Down here, again, you notice upon formal approval by and again, it has that title, the officiating body. And this is the one other area that's pretty much threaded throughout the plan, and I kind of went over it already, is the title of your master emergency plan. You're going to see that in a number of places in the document. So whenever you see that, you can either use emergency operations plan, which is the recommended name of a master emergency plan, or you can use the title of your own specific jurisdiction plan. Record of changes is pretty self-explanatory. So here again you have that reference to how often is your formal review, how many years do you go before you do an update on the plan. But a record of changes is a really important page. And the reason for that is because if somebody comes along and picks up your plan, they can actually get some sense of currency on your plan when they look at your record of changes. Record of changes, we don't really make a note of a change if there's anything small that occurs. And we're going to talk about the record of changes when we get into the section of the manual a little bit later as to what are some triggers on when you make changes. But anytime you have a change in procedure or process, or at the time of your formal review, you're going to want to make a note in your record of changes with the date, who did it, and if it's applicable, any sections. So let's say you have a change in procedure and you go in and you change section 3, you'd make a record of change note in there that you made a change to section 3. Or let's say you're doing your 2-year formal update review. What you would do in there is you'd go ahead and make a note under sections. You would just put all sections or annual review, and then you would put the date and who's responsible for keeping that record of changes. I can't tell you how many times I've gone and done, because I've actually participated in the EMAP, Emergency Management Accreditation Program, to assess emergency management programs. Can't tell you how many times I've seen plans where there's no record of changes. Now, here's the problem. Does that mean that the jurisdiction wasn't updating their plan? No, they might have been doing a really great job of updating their plan, but the challenge is the only way we know or get a sense of that currency is by that record of changes. And then, of course, there's the date on the front of the page. But we had some people in our last workshop that their plan was dated 1997 on the front of their plan, because that was the original date. But they were doing updates every year, and they were noted in the record of changes. Now, my recommendation would be that you change that front cover date. But if you don't change the cover date and you just want to leave it as that's the original date of the plan, at least your record of changes gives good due diligence that you're at least reviewing the plan. Okay. But you definitely, my recommendation is you update the cover of the page to the most current. Okay, so when we talk this page here, and this goes to what I talked to you about is you don't really, we tried to look at this annex and make it so it was covering enough information to focus on care and shelter. And that's another thing I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go from saying mass care and shelter to moving to care and shelter. And there's a really good reason, because every time people hear mass care and shelter, people get a perception. Oh, okay, well, no, we haven't opened up a shelter for hundreds of people or thousands of people. But I can guarantee you that there, in our daily jurisdictions, American Red Cross has opened up shelters with a very low number of people, and that's a care and shelter site. And so we're going to talk about that. So when we're talking about care and shelter, and there's a number of different sites that we can activate that fall under this care and shelter, we're really talking about any type of a location where you're going to provide basic human needs, whether it's for overnight sheltering or maybe you're just distributing food and water. Okay, and that's happened. For the Northridge earthquake, there wasn't a lot of sheltering, but a lot of people needed food and water because a lot of the utilities weren't going. So there were appointed distribution sites that were activated where people could come and get food and water. That's a care and shelter site. So we're going to kind of refer that throughout the day. So for this, you see where it says insert master emergency plan title? There again, that's where you're going to insert the title of your emergency plan. So there's one place that stands out in the title. This annex cross-references, there's a lot of plans that, there's information in those plans that support a care and shelter annex. And I'm going to bring up a really good example, is your evacuation annex. Okay, so when we don't want to have to repeat language in every single annex. So I'm going to give you an example. So in the city of LA, we had an emergency operations plan, which was this huge oversight. It talked about the overall emergency organization in the city, that we're going to utilize ICS. We're going to activate Unified Command. We have an emergency operations center. We have departments that have various roles throughout the city, and these are their roles, but we didn't go into in depth what everybody was doing. So these are they're strategic plans. But we also had 32 annexes. And a lot of times those the information in one annex is kind of tied to the other annex, and a reader going through that annex may want information. So there's a challenge that you might have. You might have to take information and constantly repeat writing it out. And you can do that if you want, but it's very cumbersome. And your plans jump from 20 to 30 pages to 50 to 60 pages because you're constantly repeating information. What is a great way to approach that is this cross matrix. So if I'm reading through the plan and I come across something that talks about public information, or I just refer to it, maybe I just reference it in a section in the plan, what I'm going to do by doing this cross matrix at the very beginning of the plan is, for anything regarding public information, please refer to the Public Information Annex. Okay. For anything referring to evacuation, please refer to the Evacuation Annex. So by having this cross-reference here, you don't have to rewrite language 20 to 30 times if you have separate plans. Or let's say you're a small jurisdiction and you have an emergency operations plan, but you want to start doing attachments for each type of hazard. You want an earthquake attachment or an evacuation attachment or a public information attachment. And I'll go into that a little bit deeper as we move through today. You actually don't have to keep repeating the same language. You just reference these sections or plans. So the challenge for you will be, and I'm going to turn to that page, is I have written out all of the annexes that would be referenced for this type of a plan. So if you see throughout this document where public information and communication with the public is referenced, see the Emergency Public Information Annex. Where internal communication systems are referenced, see the Communications Annex. Early warning and notification, Evacuation Annex, Local Assistance Center, Recovery Annex, There's one bullet that has a whole list of annexes. And then where city departments have tasks assigned relative to this annex. So if anybody wants to know about a specific task, let's say Rec and Parks and their activities, then they have to go to that department's standard operating procedure. What you'll need to do for this is you need to look down this list and see if these apply to your jurisdiction. So if you don't have a local assistance center annex, you're going to need to delete that. So the only thing you need to do for this page is just review it. Take a look at all of those annexes, and if you don't have them, delete it. Yeah, go ahead.
For those of us who might not have those annexes but have information referenced in our EOP, would you just recommend that we refer to the page in our EOP that has information?
Yes.
Okay.
And actually, if you look at the top paragraph, see up at the top there, a complete list of the city's hazards can be found in the local hazard mitigation plan and the EOP. That's where you could put a sentence before that is, for information on any specific, refer to the emergency operations plan. Now, what would really help the reader, though, is, and it's up to you, is you could go ahead and address these functional areas and just put where to look in the EOP. Please refer to Section 3 or Section 2. I would recommend that because you're going to have a lot of people, outside stakeholders, that are going to be looking at your plan, and it gets very challenging if they don't know kind of where to go to reference that. Then they'll come back to you and they'll say, oh, your plan's deficient because it doesn't have enough information. So that's just something that'll help you when people look at your plan. But yes, you can do that. Did everybody understand that? So if you don't have any of these annexes and it's all in your EOP, then just use the top paragraph and redact it a little bit to refer to your emergency operations plan. One of the things I recommend, though, is that as you move forward, especially if you're starting out on a strategic project to really develop really good plans, is that you look at these annexes that I have listed, and maybe you start to look at having separate attachments in your EOP. And you can do that. You don't have to have a separate standalone annex. That's not required. You can have an attachment. But what it does is it allows you to really, well, it actually helps your stakeholders. You're going to have a lot of stakeholders that only need information for one particular area of operation. And so for them to be able to have a separate attachment linked to the EOP is very helpful a lot of times. Not only that, is sometimes it's helpful when you bring together your stakeholder meetings. You may have 30 to 40 people that are in your EOP development, but maybe only 5 of them only need to be there for your care and shelter portion. So if you do a separate attachment, then you bring those people in separately, and you have the meetings to do the attachment. So it's kind of those strategies to help you manage a plan development a little bit better. So that's what you're going to do on that page, is you're going to identify those. The first actual section of the plan is an executive summary. And the reason we have an executive summary in a plan is the most critical thing that you will need to do as you're moving forward, especially if you're bringing in other people to help you draft this plan, is get the support of your executive leaders. That is so important, and it's challenging to do. One of the advantages of having an executive summary is when you sit down to meet with that executive level individual is you can provide them the executive summary. This is what's in the plan. It's a one page. It's very easy for them to digest. They're usually always busy. It's very difficult to sit them down. And then the other thing, we've provided you with the PowerPoint that we're going to be going through, is you can use this PowerPoint to brief your executive level if you want. You can take this PowerPoint, redact it, put your city logo on it, change some of the slides, but the sections you can actually use it to brief through and just do a real quick overview of the plan. But this executive summary is a really good one document briefing for those officials that highly unlikely you're going to have a lot of their time, and you're going to have to do it and probably get their buy-in early on. And we're going to talk about that in the post-workshop steps. Under the executive summary, there's 2 areas that I'm going to point out to you. One of the first questions that you're probably going to get from executive levels, a lot of times will ask you this, but you'll have other stakeholders, is why do I have to do this? Is this required? Why do I need a care and shelter annex? And it is mandated, and what we've provided with you is those official mandates that direct us to ensure that we do have care and shelter plans that reflect our ability to provide human services and animal services to those people in our jurisdiction that are impacted by a disaster. I'm not going to go verbatim through those, but you can read through them, and there's mandates at the federal level and the state level. The remaining that you'll need to identify, and there's actually an additional section, you'll notice in here that the second paragraph, you might have city policies or codes or administrative codes or requirements in your city that dictate that your jurisdiction will go ahead and have these plans in place also. That's where you're going to add those, and there's another section in the document that you'll be adding to, that you'll be placing those official policies in, and we'll go through those. There's actually 2 more sections. But that's the first place where you're going to have to identify your official policies. And then finally, if you notice down at the bottom, there's the 3 goals. What are the 3 overarching reasons that we have this plan in place? And if you notice, I gave you the goals for the workshop, but it identifies options for providing care and shelter, and it's actually going to go through a number of different situations where your jurisdiction would have to really activate a care and shelter site, activate the organization, make sure you have processes in place, and actually move through the forms. So the plan actually provides guidance on the processes and procedures, and it actually drills down into actual roles and responsibilities of various departments and other stakeholders that provide us. So this one page is for your executive level, and so I really heartily recommend that you use that as maybe a briefing document, or if you want to just put it into the PowerPoint, that's fine, but we gave you those resources. If you turn over, the next section is introduction. Okay. And introduction is really just general language. You notice there isn't a lot to change. Again, you'll see that insert jurisdiction EOP title. That's throughout the remainder of the document. There is one place that I want to point out to you, and we're going to touch on this throughout the remainder of this workshop. Down at the very bottom, there's a sentence that says, the City of has a memorandum of understanding with the American Red Cross of Greater Los Angeles, which outlines authorities, roles, and responsibilities for sheltering during a disaster. Having a memorandum of understanding with the American Red Cross is really a critical step to take and to ensure that you have a really effective care and shelter strategy and capability in your jurisdiction. The reason for this is American Red Cross is our key partner for care and shelter. They're actually identified at the national level as the lead agency, and that's very unusual under emergency support functions. All other emergency support functions at the federal level are led by a federal department. Care and shelter is led by American Red Cross, and it's the only place where another organization outside the federal department has been tasked with that responsibility. So you can probably guess that they're recognized as being the experts in this. So when you develop, and we're going to talk about MOUs a little bit later on, and Dave's going to add some pointers on that, but this is the first time you're going to see that phrase. And it's in the remainder of the document, a number of places. If you don't have an MOU currently with American Red Cross, you're going to need to delete that language, but this is what we're going to tell you. So let's move into, I'm going to do the break right after this particular slide. Is that okay, Dave? Okay, great. So we're going to go through purpose, scope, situation, and assumptions. When we talk about the purpose, that section, the language is pretty much standard. So you aren't going to have to do a lot of changes on that page. Some of them are pretty straightforward. I won't go into them. So most of that language is pretty general. It's up to you if you want to change it, but we feel that that language will stand pretty well. So you really aren't going to have a lot of work to do on the purpose. One thing I want you to notice on the purpose is we repeat the legal mandates, because this is moving beyond your executives who only wanted that one-page briefing. Hopefully you'll have some executives that will read through the whole plan. We never came across any, except our general manager. He would read it. But most of your executives, their schedules are so tight. This purpose is a much more fleshed out description of this plan. But you'll notice it repeats a lot of the information from the executive summary. So you've got the mandates there. you've got your city policies and codes that need to be referenced, and then it actually goes into the purpose of the plan. And the 3 goals are repeated in the purpose section. Okay, when we talk about the scope, there is one word in here, and I don't know where your jurisdictions sit on the California Standardized Training Institute, on their EOC credentialing program. If you aren't implementing some type of certification program for like your EOC positions, and there are actually some positions that are certified related to sheltering, care and shelter, then you're going to need to delete that word certification. If you aren't moving towards that professional certification program, that language won't apply. So you'll notice I made a little comment. If you aren't doing the CSTI program, then delete that. But down at the bottom of the scope, we drill out, we're talking about care and shelter services, care and shelter. That's the provision of shelter, feeding, bulk distribution of needed items. And then the human services, that's really that providing any supplemental services. And it really actually, that section, I think it's the 2nd paragraph down under human services, describes that out. You're going to want to read through that human services and really get a sense of what the expectation is that your jurisdiction needs to provide when we talk about human services. Because when we talk about things like feeding operations, and we'll go into that a little bit more in depth, it could be things like providing food, cultural specific food, or dietary need food. It isn't just feeding. And so when we talk about human services, it's really a lot more developed than just say we're going to provide services, and we're going to go into that a little bit in depth. The remainder of the scope is where the first place where you're going to identify those city departments, those that are primary, the key city departments. For example, for sheltering, in our jurisdiction, the key departments for sheltering were our Rec and Parks Department, and then Department of Transportation provided traffic officers for managing the traffic outside. And then our Los Angeles Police Department would provide some security resources for around the perimeter and inside the shelter facility. So when we look at key responsibilities for care and shelter, those would be my key departments. But we had a number of other supporting departments. Our General Services Department would provided a lot of logistical support. Okay, when we activated our Emergency Operations Center, we would have other departments in there that might be providing resources. We had Animal Services, we had Los Angeles Unified School District, we had American Red Cross, obviously, that sat in our mass care and shelter. So when we look at some other departments supporting that, our Animal Services Department was a support department to a care and shelter site. You might want to have departments that are listed that are that they directly relate to the public on a day-to-day basis. A good example in the city of LA was our Department of Aging. Our Department of Aging worked with senior centers, Meals on Wheels, a lot of the organizations that represent the elderly. Another department was our Department on Disability that worked with a lot of organizations that represent people with disabilities. Those departments interface with the public, those organizations, on a day-to-day basis. They are definitely departments that we want to have listed as having responsibility to not only help us in drafting the plan as a stakeholder, but also being part of the response, whether it's at the shelter site, care and shelter site, or in an emergency operations center, or maybe even at a field command. We want to list those. We want to do our supporting partner agencies. Those would be things like American Red Cross. You may have some unique agencies that support you. We had a number of agencies in the Los Angeles area that would come and help us at shelters. Private agencies representing people with disabilities. There's a lot of those out there. I think Organization for Independent Living, I can't remember the full name, is a very key advocate for people with disabilities, and they represent a lot of those organizations. And then the reason we have private transportation agencies is because transportation is a scarce resource in the region. I will tell you that the city of Los Angeles doesn't have enough transportation resources, and we pretty much have just about everything. we were resource rich, but the one thing we didn't have is we didn't have a lot of buses. We didn't have a lot of transportation resources. We had a small number for our Dash and our commuter express, I think, but we depended on Metropolitan Transit Authority. How many people would be depending on Metropolitan Transit Authority for additional transportation resources out of those resources that your city owns? I can tell you all of you probably will, because if you go to the county for mutual aid for transportation, it's the MTA. That is our mutual aid provider, and we're all going to be looking to them as a mutual aid resource. So the recommendation is you start looking at those agencies internal to your jurisdiction that could maybe provide some support transportation. What comes to mind is access services, paratransit, agencies like that, especially for those accessibility resources for transportation. You're not going to go into depth and roles and responsibilities. The only thing you're doing on this page is you're basically just listing those departments and those agencies. So it's pretty straightforward. Okay, so that's it for scope. We move into the situation next, and the situation really provides the reader with, okay, this is the city of Los Angeles. What do we need to know about the city that may be something a consideration when we're reading this plan? And really one of the advantages to a lot of the language in these sections, for those of you who draft plans, is a lot of these sections, you can put these sections into other plans. They're that generic. So if you write out the scope section in this plan, if you draft another annex, this scope can go into the scope section of that other annex. So we're not going to go into depth about how to write a plan, but I will tell you that a lot of the language, especially in these 4 first initial sections, is you can duplicate that in other plans, and you can even duplicate it in an EOP if you don't have it. But it's really critical that you describe to your readers, what does this jurisdiction look like? So obviously the first thing we want to do is we want to present a geographic picture to somebody. And when we talk about location, it's usually your boundaries. So the city of X is bounded on the north by whatever jurisdiction, or maybe it's a mountain range, okay? Or maybe on the south in San Pedro, it would be the ocean. And so you're going to want to put your 4 boundaries on the north, the south, the east, and the west, okay? That gives the reader some sense of where you sit, because we all know that Los Angeles County is huge. So that the reader kind of, okay, this plan only addresses this particular geographic location. Here we go. This is the advantage of referencing your local hazard mitigation plan, because you're supposed to identify hazards in all plans. But we know that you're drafting how many different annexes or how many different attachments. So what we do is we just reference the local hazard mitigation plan again for hazards. So if somebody wants to know what threats your jurisdiction faces, then you'll just go ahead and reference it with a local hazard mitigation plan. For the person that said, what if I just have an EOP? Under the hazards, in an EOP, you can still reference your local hazard mitigation plan. If you don't have a local hazard mitigation plan, then under this section, you have to list all those hazards. You'll have to list actually the hazards that your jurisdiction faces. So that's the advantage of having a local hazard mitigation plan, but it's a very complex plan and not everybody has one. So the 2 places that you can reference back to, if you don't need to list your hazards, is the EOP or an LHMP. Demographics really goes to your population numbers. Why do you think it's important that we provide a population number for a plan? And think of it in terms of scope and scale. So City of Los Angeles has 4 million people. How many people do you have in your jurisdiction? 150,000. So is the scope of his care and shelter annex going to look a little bit different than my care and shelter annex for the City of LA? A lot different. Not only for organization, but the number of departments, the scope of the services, how many resources. And so one of the things that it really provides the reader is a sense of size. Small jurisdiction doesn't really mean that you aren't as challenged or that you don't have the same, challenges in providing those services, because obviously smaller jurisdictions have less resources. But when you understand that I'm looking at a population of 150,000 and roughly I may have to shelter for a disaster, 10% are going to seek shelter, that gives me an idea of scope and scale of how many facilities I may have to pre-identify, right? If I have 4 million people that live in my jurisdiction at night, but I have 8 million people that are there during the day, and 10% of that population has to be sheltered, it gives me a sense of the scope of my care and shelter operations and my needs and how many facilities. So understanding your demographics really helps. The other thing that we identify, if it's available, is the percentage of increase that you've seen over the last couple years. Now, this section here, you're actually going to reference, this is the first official reference that comes up in this document. There aren't a lot of references in this document. A reference is different from an authority, okay? A reference is where you actually are citing an official source. And if you notice, there's a footnote for it. So the U.S. Census data is traditionally the place where we go for our population demographics. But your jurisdiction may have another resource where you actually can pull your population from, and another source where you might have your percentage of increase over the last year or two. Usually we do the increase in population from the last time the plan was reviewed. If you don't have that percentage, don't worry about it. It's not required. If you can get it, it's really useful in the plan. And the reason that it's good to have a percentage of increase is it gives you a sense strategically, looking ahead for the next 5 to 10 years. And for those of you who are planners, you'll kind of know what I'm kind of referring to, is when we talk about planning, we're actually trying to look to the future and anticipate and build plans so we're constantly moving towards a better capability and a better level of resources available and a better, more effective way to respond. So if I know that my population is increasing by 10 to 15% every year, and I put that in the plan, people reading the plan can start to anticipate, well, over the next year, we're going to have to start moving to increase number of resources. If our population is increasing really fast, maybe we need to review our plan every year rather than 2 years. If you have a very slow growth, your plan is probably going to remain effective. Your resources are going to remain sufficient for your population growth. So knowing your population growth is really effective when we refer to plans and strategic and moving ahead. Also in this world of grants, understanding if you have a fast-moving population, you can start to be really proactive about taking advantage of those grants out there to start purchasing more resources or developing more capability. And so it really helps you if you can start to look at that your rate of population growth. So that's the place. And be sure, and that's the first place that you're going to put that official resource. So our vulnerabilities, we don't go into the risks under vulnerabilities. What we do reference though, and I'm sure all of you have been following a lot of what's going on with the Paradise Fire and the challenges with mass notification. So there isn't a jurisdiction out there that I've come across, and I will say this because I've traveled back east into a lot of states and seen their programs. All jurisdictions face challenges with mass notifications. It's technology. And we all know about them, and we recognize them. But what we have to understand is that we have to clearly present the capability, our mass notification capability, the ability to warn the public. We have to show that and be very clear about that vulnerability. That does not take us away from the responsibility that we have to get the most effective programs in place for mass notification. And if our mass notification programs and systems aren't 100% effective, then we have to move to close those gaps by other procedures that we can implement in our jurisdiction that address that. And so I'm gonna give you an example of, because the City of Los Angeles went through litigation for compliance with American with Disabilities Act, and others with access and functional needs, and it was in relation to our plans. So in our plans, we had under notifications and warning, we had the public will be notified by through a mass notification system, and Los Angeles Police Department will be going street to street using the PA systems on their vehicles. Okay, and if they need to, they'll go and they'll just check on the homes and everything. And that was the extent of it, which you would think, okay, well, they're going along the streets, they're giving PA announcements, but there is a demographic in the disabilities community that would be a challenge, and they would not hear those warnings going up and down the streets, and they would get left behind. So this became the procedural requirement over and above our notifications that LAPD had to implement and put into their plans, and it's the right thing to do. They'll tell you that they're really glad they did, but it is cumbersome, but it's what was implemented. Is we do the mass notification system, Los Angeles Police Department with the coordination with the Los Angeles Fire Department go up and down the streets with the PA, but police officers get out and go door to door, and they knock on the doors, and then they go around with flashlights and go ahead and shine those in the windows at night to make sure that they're getting as many people as they can. So when you look at all of those procedures together, they make our early warning and notification capability stronger. And we constantly want to work to that 100% because we definitely don't want to leave everybody behind. But it is still a vulnerability. So what we state to the reader is that this is a vulnerability. And one of the things is when we talk about jurisdictions, one of the things as we move through is you'll have an opportunity as you start to look at what we need to do to provide care and shelter. You're going to start to see that you may not have all the resources available. So over the next couple months as you move to close this plan, you'll need to be reaching out to some other agencies and looking around your jurisdiction and doing a really good job of recognizing, have I identified everybody that can help? Am I working with my faith-based? Am I working with the Emergency Network of Los Angeles or the Volunteers Organization? Or are there other organizations that really will step up to the plate and help out with this? And there are. So when we talk about that, you really want to, I made a little note there that this is an opportunity as you're drafting this annex to really think out of the box and go out and identify those communities. We're going to go through assumptions, and then we're going to go ahead and take a break right after that. Under assumptions is a pretty lengthy section. There's a lot of assumptions in there, but they're broken up into two categories. The first bullet list of assumptions are really all hazards assumptions. Okay, so if we look at the first bullet, in any disaster, primary consideration is given to the preservation of life. Additionally, time and effort must be given to providing critical life-sustaining needs. For anybody that's taken incident command system training, you'll know that this is our top priority in emergency management, is life safety, preservation of property, stabilization of the incident. So right away, that's the assumption that we describe to the reader. This plan was written with that priority that everything is done with the consideration that life safety is a top priority. I'm not going to go verbatim through all of those assumptions under the all hazards section. So just take a note on that, but those are a kind of general assumptions that we've written for you. And then there's assumptions that we've written for specific to care and shelter. So as far as the specific ones to care and shelter, if you'll notice again, there's where we see, I think it's on page 9, where that MOU with the American Red Cross jumps up again into the language. So there's a point where if you don't have an MOU yet, you're going to need to delete that. So for this section, what you need to do is go through every single assumption, the all hazards and the those care and shelter specific assumptions, and make sure they apply to your jurisdiction, because not all of them may. This is a pretty comprehensive list. I feel that we've captured a good portion of the assumptions that will apply, But feel free to add additional assumptions that you may have that are specific to your jurisdiction. But this section, you'll really need to do a good job and go through those. Just don't take them verbatim. Read through them and make sure they apply to your section. Okay? And I think that is it for this. So we can go ahead and let me see a couple notes here. Okay. Oh, so on page 10, we refer to the City Supplemental ARC Standard Shelter Forms Manual. We actually gave those forms to you in your book. So there's no separate manual. I don't know if that sentence is still in there. It's at the top of the page. There's a comment on it. I'll pull it up. Hold on a second.